So the Battle of Midway. Okay. This is a whole fun of things from a leadership perspective. It really is, because you have so many different levels of government and leadership getting involved, and so many different issues to go through. It truly is amazing how bad some people can make things. And it always sounds conceited coming across in a British voice, but let me talk about this, After all, the Battle of Midway. And camera, go to a record position, please, like you were supposed to. No, I have no idea. What are you doing? There we go. Camera's far too smart. As you can see, my entire month's supply now, I am mildly, dieting. Entire month's supply of Iron Brew is sitting there. You'll be able to watch it in real time as it goes down. But leaving that to one side, and leaving my love of Iron Brew to one side, the Battle of Midway. Now, I'm wearing a May Spontaneously Talk About Battleships today t-shirt today, and honestly, that's going to come into Midway more than you think, because I have this small thing I have to explain to people sometimes. Whilst it is certainly true that the Battle of Pearl Harbor is not a Kantai-Kessen, the reason it's not is because of the sheer amount of the force available, what they're planning, and how they're planning on operating. Honestly, it's always strikes me more as a preparatory, and I've explained fully in the video, of more of a attack to get the Americans to come storming across the Pacific to save the Philippines, already at a weakness, as sort of first attrition, and then there'll be the Kantai-Kessen once the American full fleet is in range. But the trouble is, Pearl Harbor goes rather too well, but not well enough. It's not well enough to knock the US fleet out of the war for the next 2 years, because it doesn't include knocking out the carriers. And let's be honest, you might go, well, hang on, Saratoga would have still decided, there would have still been Ranger. Yeah, but if you take out Enterprise and Yorktown, if you take out Lexington, if you take out the carriers which could have been there, that's 2 of the big fleet carriers. And yes, they end up with Yorktown. She was at Norfolk, wasn't she? She wasn't there, but I was thinking about her for other reasons in this battle, of course. And Saratoga, so they end up with having 2, and they have Hornet, so 3 eventually, but that's still going to put them at a disadvantage. And yes, there are all sorts of discussions about what a potential third wave could have been if they'd launched that at Pearl Harbor, and my view has always been, and there is a discussion on this one, as to their likely targets would be to bomb cruisers and infrastructure, primarily infrastructure. The reason I say that is because if they did launch a third wave, they're only going to be launching that if they're sure the aircraft carriers and battleships have already been taken out. And at that point, they might wish to expend their remaining torpedoes at cruisers. But if they are not sure if they've taken out the carriers, or if the carriers weren't present, then it makes sense to get us with bombs. And infrastructure is as easy to hit as the cruisers in terms of bombs and surface damage. Because you wouldn't want to expend the torpedoes, you want to save them for attacking a carrier. But the thing is, Pearl Harbor is just a mess, really, from a results perspective for the Japanese. It is a mess from a results perspective. In every stretch of the scenario, it just is. It's a mess. And this carries on. From the war perspective, the Japanese keep doing well, but not well enough to achieve what they really need to achieve to have not a chance of winning the war. Please don't get me wrong, I don't think they ever really have a chance of winning the war. I don't think any of their own commanders have. But I think achieving a sufficient enough victory that they might get some sort of negotiational pause in the war so they can actually strengthen themselves properly before they're overrun. Yeah, there is that sort of aim is certainly something they can aim for. But saying this, Midway is a weird battle because if any battle plan does start to look like, from the Japanese perspective, approaching a Kantai-Kessen battle plan, it's actually Midway. It is actually Midway. And that is a weird thing to say. Midway is, of course, not a decisive battle. It's not, well, it is a decisive battle, but not in the way the Japanese would like. But it is also, it's just a weird operation in so many ways. And I'll be getting into this and some of the leadership things. And there's even the point of which operations do we compare the Japanese strategic planning to? And this is often the thing. I once read a book which says Midway cannot be compared for complexity of the Japanese concept of operations to any other operation during World War II. And immediately when I read that, I went, or rather, well, I did actually do the in my head, but then I thought, well, actually, no, probably you just haven't read beyond American and Japanese operations in World War II, because I can think of one other on a similar level of complexity. But there is a difference. There is an important difference between those operations. And this is something we're going to be getting into today. So there's a lot of things to talk about. It's quite a fun one. It's quite an interesting one. And yeah, it really is. Also, Saturday's video is going to be, I think, what makes a propeller from a form suitable for one task but not another on Patreon. I'm not sure about that as a premiere. It's kind of interesting asking a historian to give that. I've kind of been dodging that as a topic because I'm the history of engineering, and there's an actual friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who's an actual engineer, who would probably be better to give that talk rather than me. I am the son of a naval architect. I've spent a lot of time listening to him, and I teach history of engineering and have taught all the history of it. But it's what I'm more likely going to give is the history of the propeller and how it's evolved to adapt to various forms, rather than giving and hopefully answering a question that way, than a pure, this propeller does this propeller does that, because I think that better fits my skill set. But the Pacific War so far, I've already sort of got into that, but it's worthwhile considering it. You see, the Japanese have been running rampant prior to Coral Sea and Midway. And Coral Sea was... Coral Sea was an interesting battle, in that technically we tend to put it in the inconclusive category. It's got a lot of significant results, but it's inconclusive, as neither side can really go away claiming, oh, we've won a staunch victory. And both sides turned up with roughly the same amount of force when you look into it. And it's one of those things of, yes, the Japanese are frustrated and they suffer losses. It's a Jutland scenario. It's a tactical victory for one side because they inflict more losses on the other, and a strategic victory for the other side because they stop the Japanese advance, and they stop them advancing, and the Allies stop the Japanese advancing. But Coral Sea is a mess, really. And the thing is, it doesn't really stop the Japanese advancing. It causes them to pause and have to plan their next operation. And next operation is Midway. And it's one of those points in the war where, okay, Japan has been dictating the pace and momentum of the conflict up until this point. They have been managing to control what was happening. They have been setting the tone of the operation. Everyone's been reacting to them. They haven't been reacting to others. And yes, the Americans are starting to launch their carrier raids. Yes, the Americans are doing all sorts of things. But fundamentally, everyone is still following the tune set by the Japanese. They're following the tune. And that's a problem. Because you can't win a war you are following the tune of, when you're following the tune of someone else. Even if you have more resources, even if you have more capabilities in terms of breadth of force and in your technology, if your opponent is setting the pace, is setting the terms, is setting the rhythm of the conflict, they're going to set it to best suit them, to play their advantages against your disadvantages, whatever they might be. And they will win. The thing is, you have to try and use your advantages to gain control of the momentum. And realistically, the Allies do have some advantages. Their biggest advantage is intelligence. I'm not talking about their brain power. I'm not saying they're smarter, before anyone who hasn't ever watched a history video before about war starts thinking that's it. And I honestly did have that conversation yesterday with someone who literally thought, when we talked about military intelligence, we were talking about how the IQs of the people involved. Okay. I'm talking about information. I'm talking about knowing what the enemy is doing. Being able to put yourself in the mind of the enemy because you know what the enemy's thinking and saying and talking with each other. And usually there's about 3 forms of intelligence we will gather. Human intelligence, which will be gathered by spies. There's signals traffic analysis, where we are studying the flow of signals and the volume of signals, i.e. the quantity of them, going backwards and forwards to places. That will usually tell you a lot pretty quickly about where is important. Where is communicating with where will tell you what matters. As a rule, and will often give you information about, oh, they're communicating, oh, there's that's flashing up, that's flashing up. Oh, it's one of the major things in that World War II. It's still interesting to note that the cracking of Enigma and all that things have been declassified. The signals traffic analysis done, which was far more critical to the prosecution of the Battle of Atlantic and various things against the Germans, hasn't been. Worthwhile considering that. And it's rather similar if we look at the Japanese and the Pacific theatre of war. Look what's been declassified and is talked about, and look what hasn't been declassified and talked about. A lot of the intelligence information that's talked about is the cool, sexy stuff of, we decrypted their message and then we could do this, this, and this. What about the signals traffic analysis? And it's crickets. Just crickets. Can't hear anything. There's little bits. There are little bits, don't get me wrong. There are little bits, but there is a huge stonking mass of it, because in terms of volume of effort and volume of personnel involved and the volume of data gathered, there is the decrypted information, which makes up this pile. And there is the signals traffic analysis, which would be this pile. You know, massive in comparison. And we know about half to a third of the decrypted stuff, and we know about the same amount of the signals traffic analysis data. That's a lot smaller percentage of that. And so you've got this data, this information coming through, and what's the third source? Well, I said signals traffic analysis, signals interception. So those are your 3 sources of data. You're in terms of intelligence. Now, then you're going to have reconnaissance or recognizance, depending on who you're talking to and when you're talking about it. And one means we reckon we saw something, one means we recognize what we saw. And often you could say it comes down to the quality of the pictures taken by the aircraft involved, because you don't have satellites in this period. So it's basically what have long-range aircraft picked up and spotted, or cruisers picked up and spotted, or submarines picked up and spotted and taken photos of and sent messages about. So this sort of reconnaissance information also feeds into it. And you can do little games with this. If you think, and this is exactly what happens at Midway, you can send a message, get Midway to send a message. That would be a normally and not a message which you would honestly encrypt that heavily, or you wouldn't even decrypt, which would just be a status report about, let's say, water supply. Okay, we need to get more water there, and then wait and see in the decrypted signals you're managing to decrypt. Just mention of water supply. It's a way to try and work out which one they're targeting. Now, the really big advantage that's going on in intelligence at this point is a guy called Turner is no longer involved. Okay? Now, Admiral Turner has many fans and is very good in many ways. But as director of operations, he seized control of the flow of intelligence information going out to support commanders like the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and worked with the Roosevelt government. And it was him who specifically stopped. Not only did they stop the briefings going out to them, the independent briefings, independent data going out to the Pacific, but when he had a 50-50 chance he thought it might be Pearl Harbor, he didn't see fit to inform, based on the information he could see, because he could still see the full information, to inform his counterpart in Pearl Harbor that there was a 50-50 chance. He just informed them, no, my gut says it's going to be the Philippines. So they neither got the data, nor the fact that the guy who was running the intelligence at that point believed that, well, actually, I might be wrong. And that explains a lot of what happens at Pearl Harbor and a lot of the senior officers' decisions at Pearl Harbor. Because honestly, what do you do if you think Pearl Harbor's going to be attacked? You probably do surge the fleet. You probably try and get them out. Because in Harbor, they can't defend themselves. They can't maneuver. They cannot maneuver. They cannot defend themselves. They cannot fire freely. You want to get them out. You want to get them out of that harbor as far away as possible. And if you're going, well, what do you think we might get attacked with? We don't know. Probably it's going to be an air attack. Okay, battleships can't really... we don't really want the battleships to be fighting aircraft. So we probably move them out, and you probably send them... it's going to sound strange, but southeast? Because you might think that's the axis of advance, but that would actually also send them to where the carriers are coming from. And so they can meet up with the carriers. But that doesn't happen. But at this point, Turner is off involved in fleets and doing all sorts of things, and he's actually being fairly useful. He's not brilliant, but he's being fairly useful. Okay, and pretty much King and Nimitz are doing their best to keep him as far away from anything they have to deal with on a daily basis as possible, so they don't have to deal with the fact that he is Roosevelt's favorite. And the Pacific War has developed from there. The Japanese have been winning, but so the Americans. The American submarines are really doing very well. Broadly speaking, Singapore, Ceylon, the raid in Operation Sea, the raid into the Indian Ocean, all these things, they have been well-conducted operations by the Japanese, which have brought them great advantage and allowed them to dominate things. Again, Operation Sea is a bit of a missed opportunity, and I do sometimes wonder if the Allies had known more in advance what was going to happen, what they might have done, because you could have done some very interesting traps in the Indian Ocean if you'd wanted to. Because the Japanese were stepping out far beyond where they could be properly supported. In many ways, Midway in comparison is a well-supported operation, a well-sustained operation. Operation Sea, if known in advance, could have been turned into an absolute nadir for the Japanese because of where those forces were deployed and what there was to support them. But it wasn't, because the intelligence hadn't caught up at that point. But it's caught up by Midway. It's caught up after Coral Sea. It's now caught up. And this is the point. The Japanese have been... And the Japanese have their own intelligence operation. They're doing their own as well to try and crack the American codes and try and listen in. They are getting not as good access to information. And I would say that's mostly because of where the American communications are going and how the American communications are being broadcast and where you have your intercept positions. It's a bit of a mess, but if you consider the main trunk and flow of information is going back from the American is at Pearl Harbor, that's where Nimitz is, to go back to Washington, there isn't a lot of Japanese listening posts between Pearl Harbor and Washington. There isn't a lot of options for them to listen in and know what's going on. So, this is a problem. Whereas for the Japanese forward posts, there are a lot of spaces where there are American submarines listening in, there are other systems being set up to intercept and able to get in and permeate into their areas where you can listen to their communications and get them quite clearly. It's an advantage. But still, the Japanese High Command are planning an operation, and they are planning Midway. And when we're talking about the Japanese High Command at this point, realistically, when it comes to naval operations, we're talking about these four men. Yes, they have staffs. Yes, they have people below them. Yes, they have all sorts of people feeding into them. And yes, you might believe some of the accounts of those staff officers more than others. Usually myself, when I find personal accounts, I operate on a policy of they are usually that person's version of the truth from their memories of their perspective of events. And if you put that in mind when reading them, then suddenly you're not looking at them from the point of view of, am I proving or disproving this? Is this the gospel truth? You're going, no, hang on. This is one person's memories of their perspective of events. Treat it kind of like you would children who are coming in and who are telling you about something which took place, which no adults were watching, but there was an incident. You get a dozen different accounts. And from that, you try and figure out what actually happened. You look for the commonality, you look for the differences, you look at their positions, you look at, what kind of access, what kind of level input they're going to have, and then you work it through. So it's worthwhile considering those things when we're talking about them. But the officers we're talking about are Isoroku Yamamoto, Admiral Osami Nagano, Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, and Vice Admiral Chushi Nagumo. And these are, respectively in chief, the commander of the combined fleet, who is probably the most important of the ones. Because the chief of staff of the IJN, Asami Nagano, one has to basically consider him the political head of the Navy. Yes, there's a minister. Yes, he's got to represent and argue for the Navy's case when it comes to cabinet meetings and discussions, but realistically the Chief of Staff is the head of the Navy. But also, in a very real way, both of them answer to Yamamoto. Because he has the most personal power within the Navy. And he is going to take the lead in the planning and the concept of operations. And they are deciding they've got to do something. This is the trouble. Midway is one of those operations which starts out because they've got to do something, and then it's built on from there. We've got to do something, especially after Coral Sea. We've got to do something because of these American attacks on Japan. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. And it's one of the few times, actually, when someone can make that argument, and I will stand there and go, well, yes, you do have to do something. Regularly, when people tell me they've got to do something because something needs to be done, I go, you're just doing something for the sake of looking like you're doing something. Is that actually a worthwhile activity? Is what you're doing going to be a helpful activity? Or is it better to just sit and do nothing? Or is it better to go and do something else which is unrelated, or which people might not even think is going to be valid, but actually is going to be better long term? Are we actually putting our energy into the right thing? In this case, they have to do something, because if you don't do anything, then you're going to see control of that rhythm. You're going to see control of the energy and the tune of the war. And so you have to do something. But debating what is quite an interesting one. And each group has their own idea. Midway is in many ways a compromise. They have all sorts of ideas they're considering, including a push on Australia, another push into the Indian Ocean. All sorts of things come up and are considered and then are shot down for various reasons, sensible reasons. The Indian Ocean, the Eastern Fleet, is now on a far firmer footing and is getting itself more and more organised from the British perspective. And with America's entry into the war and the difference in pace going on, you also have changes over in command, which means there's likely to be more resources available to the Eastern Fleet should the British hear they're coming. And the intelligence assessments are getting more accurate, so they will know they're coming. And that's one of the things. The Japanese do have a realistic appraisal of Allied intelligence. They are, sadly enough, in World War II, it's often apparent that the power which gets the most talked about from the Axis side often seems to, either through its own reason or because of actions of senior intelligence officers of its own formations, have the lowest level of understanding and comprehension of their opposition. I would say often Italy, especially at a tactical level, understands their opponents far better than the Germans do. And have certainly been preparing themselves, if they've been given more time, to be far better against them than the Germans were. I'd say that's probably because the Germans ultimately keep changing their target of who they're going to fight against, and they can manage to confuse themselves. The Japanese are very good at getting information about the various positions and getting understanding of what their opponents are potentially capable of. Their big issue is due to their own limited capabilities. They design operations where if the enemy doesn't do exactly what they want to do, they are going to be in trouble. And this is something which gets worse as the war goes on. As the war goes on, things get worse. And things like, they don't think about, in terms of Midway planning and in terms of lot planning, they don't think about the Americans getting another carrier from somewhere. Now, you can argue, well, it's an amazing feat. It is a feat. They get the third carrier, gets repaired and gets to come out to the battle, and that is a big thing. It is. It is a big thing. It is a feat. It is something worthy of thinking about. Task Force 17, Fletcher's Task Force, Group on Yorktown. That is an amazing thing. Getting Yorktown into service, getting it out to the battle. But the fact is, America has more carriers around. They have other carriers, and there's the British. Designing an operation and presuming you are only going to face X amount of aircraft and they are going to come from a certain direction, that only really helps you. And this is the problem for Japanese planning. They are not very good at giving their opponent agency in their operational concepts. I would argue that's a big problem in their pre-war planning and pre-war doctrines. But there again, if you look at their historically, look at their experience. The Russians played in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, 1904, played exactly into their doctrine. They came to them. They brought themselves at the end of a long logistics chain to them in a bad fighting condition, and then lined up neatly and were massacred at the Battle of Tsushima. That is it. Look at World War One. Their experience fighting the Germans at Tsingtao. It works for them. Monde Qingdao, by the way. If you consider some of their experiences versus the Chinese, and even watching other powers, everyone has so far in their recent military experience played exactly into what the Japanese were hoping they would do. Is there any wonder they start to consider themselves masters of the universe? If people always consistently do what they want to do, now the thing is, you might go, well, hang on. Putting your same war plan versus the Americans and Brits as you did against the Russians. Well, the Russians in the 1900s, and even at this point, have barely any infrastructure and have to send a fleet all the way around the world. The British and the Americans have lots of infrastructure. They're able to support and sustain fleets a long way from home. And yes, you might have taken Singapore, but you haven't taken Ceylon, you haven't taken Bombay, you haven't taken India, and all the bases the British have there to support the fleet, and all the dockyards they have there, and there's Australia, and the Americans also have access to the same dockyards, and Hawaii, and the west coast of the United States, and it's a very different scenario, and also you're dealing with fleets which are fundamentally larger. The American and the British fleets in World War II are the two largest fleets in the world. They are. Even with the experience of years of war fighting against the Germans and Italians, the Royal Navy is still bigger than the Japanese by a long way. And they're even bigger than the Americans for quite a chunk of it. And again, before anyone starts saying America, is amazing. I'm not saying America wasn't amazing. It's your Congress, okay? Consistently. The biggest threat to the US Navy in terms of numbers and abilities is Congress. Delaying funding, not approving it, because of the process of, how it gets funded. You have to have first a bill which allocates a need and then a bill which actually funds it. And sometimes those bills are together, but sometimes they aren't. And sometimes the Congress will go, actually, no, what the Navy want is not what we think they should have, so we're going to give them this, and we're going to fund it this way. And, that it's a whole fun and games, okay? So, anytime the US Navy is not as powerful as it should be, it's no one's fault, and it's no one being rude about the US Navy. It's Congress, okay? It is Congress. I'm sorry. America, great country. American politicians, like most nations in the world, are a long-running issue. Okay, because usually they want everything's a compromise between what they have to spend on and what they want to spend on. And it's rare they want to spend on armed forces in peacetime, because that necessarily won't get them re-elected. And that is also something the Japanese are taking advantage of. This is the thing. The Japanese fundamentally look at the American, the British, and these big democracies, and they look at them and slow to react. And they look at their governments and they think they have problems, and they're not going to be able to deal with things. They're not going to be able to make the decisions they need to do. They're not going to be prepared to do the sacrifices necessary for war. And that feeds into their thinking. That feeds into their concept. And while some of these men have intimate knowledge of their American and British counterparts, and do understand that that assessment is not correct. That really isn't. And in fact, we might be a Greeks versus Roman situation. We think we're fighting for a negotiated peace, like we got after the Russo-Japanese War. The British and the American equivalent of a negotiated peace is, okay, we've beaten you. You are now on the ground. Here are your terms for peace. There's a difference. I usually use Greeks and Romans as an example because the Greeks tend to have wars between their city-states. And they'd have a big battle, and depending on the results of the battle, they'd then have a negotiated peace treaty, and it would be worked out quite nicely. This said that it put them in a very bad position when they're fighting the Romans, because they won a battle. And then they sent envoys to Rome to negotiate. And the Romans went, no. We're sending more legions. And the Greeks were confused, because it wasn't how they did things. But the Romans don't fight it that way. The Romans didn't fight it that way. And when we have the American High Command, now yes, Turner's now gone, so intelligence is in the firm, kind hands of Theodore Stark Wilkinson, and he is a very good DNI. He really is. The fact that a lot of the changes to the High Command had possibly been carried out because, well, when King becomes Chief of Naval Operations and Nimitz becomes Commander-in-Chief US Pacific Fleet, those posts, to put it in phrases which King used, or rather would have liked to use, they'd chosen sons of bitches for them. Now, they are hard-charging gentlemen. They certainly are. And Wilkinson is a thoughtful gentleman, which is exactly what you want for head of naval intelligence. And realistically, between the three of them, they have a very accurate idea of what's going on. They know they don't yet have the force in place. They don't yet have the necessary overmatch of capabilities they need to go on the offensive against the Japanese in modern raiding operations. But they also think they can do their own traps. And one of the interesting things we'll be getting into in this battle and into the concept of operations is that the Japanese think they're doing a trap on the Americans by forcing them to defend Midway and coming out, and they think they'll trap them. And the Americans are springing a trap on the Japanese. Both sides think are sure they're trapping each other. Thanks to intelligence and the information they're gathering, the Americans have more of an advantage in this. But realistically, they are both doing the level of operations their forces allow them to do. They're also putting in a lot of effort into defending things that need to be defended and into making sure they have the resources available. One interesting thing about Yorktown and its preparations and being prepared for battle and being prepared for Midway is that that's able to be done because of the resources which have already been pushed into Pearl Harbor, the resources which are already there in the shipyard and which they've added in, and the stuff that's been put in place to make sure they have the facilities there to do it. What's quite scary is when you realise how many of those facilities were not there before the actual attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. They just weren't. Realistically, America by this point is still in the infrastructure build-up phase of their war operations. They were not realistically ready for war at this point. That's because of the delays that have happened to their own build-up. Even with a war going on in Europe and all the other things, there has still been so much of a debate, so much of an argument over it, and honestly, the US is also hamstrung by a few other things of their policies. One interesting thing to realise is that Rear Admiral Wilkinson is the only one who's actually acting in their rank out of these people. The substantive rank of every single US naval officer is Rear Admiral once they're at that level. they don't get any more senior. They don't become more senior. This is why Kimmel's busted straight down to Rear Admiral. Because that is their substantive rank. Everything else is an acting rank. Everything is a post only, where you have this post. And King himself had been promoted and demoted. His career had been, he'd gone up to a senior rank, and then he had to drop down to Rear Admiral for an operation in the Atlantic and various things. And he hadn't bothered about it. He just wanted to come on. But that was the way they were. And you could go, yes, there are some advantages to this. There are some, because it means that, you can promote anyone you want, the best officer, into a certain position, because they're all the same rank. And you can choose the command structure you want. There are advantages to this. There are problems when you're working with allies, and their ranks are substantive, because then technically a substantive rank is always outranking an acting rank. See the problem when the British Pacific Fleet turns up, and the reason why Bruce Fraser keeps well away from areas of operations? Because he's a full admiral, and that's his substantive rank. If he goes out to the various operation areas, he outranks his US counterparts. Very rarely. Until Congress fixes that, that's a problem. That's one of the issues. And that's actually one of the lesser-known issues that King actually brings up about the British deploying into the Pacific. The rank issue. Because honestly, that had been annoying him. Because it doesn't make sense once you're dealing with a senior force. And a senior force, or rather a capable force, of course, of the size you're dealing with. It makes sense when you're dealing with a small navy, which doesn't need anyone more senior than a Rear Admiral. When you are one of the largest navies, one of the two largest navies in the world, yeah, we're not going to have anyone with a more substantive rank than Rear Admiral. Doesn't really work. Now, you could argue that today, armed forces are too top-heavy. You could argue in modern times they are too top-heavy. But one of the problems you have is that rank and experience is often needed for some of the complexity of positions you have happening back on land in terms of development and things going on. You need someone in charge who is senior enough to be able to handle the political side of that procurement, as well as the operational side and the integration into the force side. And suddenly that means you're probably dealing with someone who's going to be Commodore Rear Admiral rank. And that's why there's the surge in those numbers of officers versus the numbers you had in the interwar period and in World War II. Especially true with the US forces, which often it's common to... The US during World War II had less senior officers than it has now. Well, yes, but that was also because the US had, in the interwar years, had programs which were being run by captains in a system where the senior substantive rank you can get to was Rear Admiral, so captain's the next one below that, because they didn't have Commodore as a substantive rank. You have programs being run by captains, which in any other navy in the world would have been run by an admiral, because of the issues being required. And this is also what causes some of the fun during World War II and some of the sudden rank growth of people, because once you actually are in a situation where, oh frig, we've got all this going on, you suddenly start having to give people the ranks they should actually have had in order to be able to do the job that you're requesting of them. But yes, the American High Command is juggling a lot of problems. One of them, the biggest one, is that they are always short of tankers. They are always short of fuel. And in many ways, the selection of Midway actually plays into their hands because it's so close to Pearl Harbor. It's in the Midway. It's in the Hawaiian Islands chain. Yes, it's 1,200 miles, but it's still within the chain. And in naval operations terms, 1,200 miles is a skip away. It's really not that big once you start talking in terms of naval operations. With that being said, what was the Japanese concept of operations. Now, what I love about this map is that it really does show the sensible things and the not sensible things. Midway gets you closer to Hawaii. Great. You planning on taking Hawaii? No. There's not much advantage. But it does theoretically also put another hamper in anyone doing raids on the home islands from Hawaii. And does theoretically provide you with a position that the Americans are going to have to attack and take back. It's kind of like the same advantage as if you took Hawaii. If the Japanese had combined the attack on Pearl Harbor with landing land forces and bringing battleships in to deal with the shore defenses and landing troops and overwhelming the garrison and actually physically taking over Hawaii, then the American concept operations would have become not Europe first, not anything. It would have to take back Hawaii first. And everything would be focused on that. And the Japanese would have just need to keep basically a strong fleet in that area to deal with what the Americans would attack with. But they don't do that. And Hawaii, and Midway in many ways, is going to fill that sort of role. The idea was not the Americans would attack them necessarily with a fleet when they were taking Midway. They thought they'd be able to take. There is some debate at concept operations whether they thought they would be able to take Midway quite quickly and easily. And if they took it, once they've taken it, then the Americans are going to have to come for them. And then the Americans are going to have to fight and try and take it back. And it's going to become an axis they can constantly draw. Because they tried to go down the Coral Sea route. They tried to cut off the supply routes between America and Australia, so they could take all the areas they need to, and maybe even eventually take Australia. They've tried that. That's what the Battle of Coral Sea was about. That was the blunting of that option. Now, it's okay, right, and we need to draw out the American fleet. We need to take out the American fleet Midway. But there is one problem here. I spoke earlier about the different concepts of plans, and I'm going to explain this. Similarly complicated plan is what I would call Operation MB8. The Midway operation is part of Operation MI. Okay? And it also includes operations going up in the Aleutians and all sorts of things being done by the Japanese elsewhere. They have got all sorts of complicated maneuvers going on. And the similarity is, if you look at Taranto and the attack on Taranto early in the war, that was all part of Operation MB8, where there is Ark Royal going and hitting something, convoys going across, all sorts of things. It presents the enemy with a very complicated picture and dilemma of what to do, and it means they miss what you're necessarily actually doing. Now, the difference between Cunningham's Operation MB8, and here, that was the admiral in charge of Mediterranean at the time of that, and Yamamoto's Operation MI, is that Cunningham had lots of forces doing relatively simple objectives individually on their level. Lots of forces doing relative, but overall presenting the enemy with a very complicated picture because there's so much going on. Yamamoto tries to present his enemy with gives his forces very complex orders of how they're to maneuver, how they're to work with him, how they're going to operate together, how they're going to conduct operations, but actually gives the enemy quite a simple image to pick, because there's only two real big thrusts going on. There's a northern thrust and a southern thrust. There's Midway and there's the Aleutians. And the trouble with this, I would argue, is that this then requires a lot of senior officers to work together, and is going to increase the volume of communication. Okay, it's going to increase the amount of information you can gather from signals traffic analysis. Not just the amount of potential intercepts you can decrypt and understand and read your enemy's work, the amount of information you can get from signals traffic analysis, because those various groups are going to have to communicate internally more, etc., and all these things to actually generate the desired effect. That was the thing about Operation MB8. The signals traffic analysis for the Italians was atrocious in that thing, because the concepts, the individual operations were simple enough that the British forces didn't need to talk that much. They could communicate. Their long-range communication was quite rare, and a lot of their communications were taking place over signal lamp and flag, which couldn't be intercepted unless you were in the right position between two ships watching the signal lamps go across. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. The moment you have to have wide area radio communications between multiple forces proceeding onto the same target, working in concert, and multiple admirals having to try and coordinate their forces over such a large area, you have problems. You're starting to give your enemy information. Now, why do I say there is an issue between whether or not the Japanese were actually planning for the Americans to intercept the Midway force and actually fight them on the attack? Because whilst that is certainly what happens, and that is often mooted as the plan and put forward as a plan, there is part of me which sincerely thinks, with the amphibious force and everything else they're taking with them, they're expecting to have landed and then get attacked. They're expecting the Americans to be suitably confused by the Aleutians operations, by the Northern Thrust, to go towards territory which is American home territory. Remember, it's part of Alaska. That the Americans are not going to be necessarily charging straight into Midway. They're also expecting the Americans to be operating on a lot less forces than they actually have available, so be faced with far bigger dilemma. So the Americans to be delayed, waiting for forces to build up, is a likely contingency in the Japanese mindset. So the Japanese concept of operation is not a bish bash bosh, we've got Midway. It's we're going to threaten these two key points, give you a dilemma, and then you're going to come out and attack us after we're bedded in, and we're going to be able to crack you when you do it. Because if you come out, especially if you bring amphibious forces or try and do anything like that, your forces are going to be tied location-wise, which means we can hit you hard. This also explains some of the positioning of the submarines and the organisation of the wider force as part of this concept of operations. The fundamental point of this concept of operation is plan. Is that dispersed forces doing all these different things, but most importantly not being able to mutually support each other because they'd be so widely dispersed, would be able to cause the Americans to not see what he's doing. And the key to that was the speed of the Kido Butai, which was both his best sword and shield. However, I'd also say, fundamentally in the concept of operations, if you are putting this amount of effort into your sword and shield, if something is going to be your sword and shield, it had better be heavily protected. And that's one of the things I find really interesting when I do compare it to MB8 versus MI to MB8, the two operations. Cunningham's concept of operations always has his jewels, the core part of the things he's using, whether they're carriers or capital ships or cruisers even, depending on whatever they are, well protected. I think if you told Admiral Cunningham that you were going to send off your most important assets, i.e., well, in this particular operation, 4 carriers, and you were going to give them an escort, which was made up of 2 battle cruisers. Well, Haruna and Krishina. One of them is flirting with the fast battle cruiser line due to subdivision, but the other one's certainly still in the battle cruiser one. 2 cruisers, 2 Tony-class cruisers, but still 2 cruisers, a light cruiser, and 15 destroyers, he'd probably look at you and go, what? What? What are you doing here? It becomes really quite bad when you consider that, well, there are other battle cruisers going around. There are 2 other Congos still around. There are other destroyers. And almost, you want to go to, you want to go to Yamato and go, look, your concept of operations, your idea of doing, that's always good. But you're leaving your critical pieces exposed here. So cut one of the forces and give the escorts to that group. Because you've got a light carrier, which is the Hosho. Why the frigate you're taking that with you when it only has 8 biplane torpedo bombers? Yokosuka B4Ys on it, Port. Get rid of that. There's no need to do that. Can Yamato keep up with the carriers? Can it? If it can, great. It goes with the carrier group. Nagato class, I don't think they're going to keep up. I don't. And I don't really think Yamato's really going to keep up. It's a 27-knot ship. It doesn't even qualify as a fast battleship. That's the joy. The King George V's, they're 28-knot ships. They qualify as fast battleships. Yamato, 27-knot ship. Doesn't qualify as a fast battleship. It's a big battleship. Trust me, it's a big one. But it's not a fast one. You have to cut off somewhere, and I'm sorry, it's at 28 knots. It just is. It's like when we're defining battle cruisers and things, there's a speed requirement to be. You have to have a battleship grade subdivision and armor coverage, but you need to be 28 knots and above to be a fast battleship. Below 28 knots, you're a normal battleship. And then it's a case of right then. So you've got less armor coverage, less less subdivision. So your area spaces are larger. Okay, therefore you are a battle cruiser. One word, not a fast battleship, and then it gets even less coverage and even less subdivision, and then you're a battle cruiser, 2 words, or a dreadnought armored cruiser if you want to go early in their designation. And the joyous thing is that sometimes you get comments and people go, well, what about the torpedo protection? And that has really nothing to do with it, other than most ships which are built on the treaty system have a very incredibly compromised torpedo protection, because that's something they cut down on, hoping they can base that on other things. And most ships which are built and have the designs finalized post the treaty system have a far better capability. And so you can't really use that as a dividing line between the two. And it's also it's a fun thing to get into. But Yamato theoretically could have kept up. You could have brought from other formations the other 2 Congos. You could have brought in other cruisers. You could have brought in other destroyers. You could have given those ships a better escort. Theoretically, every single one of those carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiro, and Soryu, should have at least had 1 cruiser dedicated to them with air defense. At least 1 cruiser dedicated as their air defense asset. And preferably they should have actually had an aircraft. They should have had a cruiser and a capital ship with them as dedicated assets. And also, they'll probably divide the American attacking aircraft as well. But that wasn't what happened. It wasn't the case. And so you have this really interesting concept of operations where there's a lot of thought being given into it, but overall they haven't really they haven't put enough thought into, okay, what happens if X happens? What happens if Y happens? They're being very risky, taking a lot of risk on them, which they don't need to. For the operation to still be as successful, still be as interesting as it possibly could be, and still be as problematic for the Americans to deal with as possible, it doesn't need to be that. In fact, honestly, here's another dirty trick you can do, and this comes straight out of the Cunningham playbook. You can send off a couple of cruisers and a couple of destroyers, and they can make a whole lot of noise, pretending to be something bigger than they are. And that can throw enemy signal traffic analysis into complete uproar. It's possible. You just have them going, right, and we're going to keep submitting a status report every a certain amount of time, and we're going to slightly change our positions in what, so we're going to look like we're more ships than we are in this group, and it's a larger formation coordinating. Enemy has to come find you to find out. And yes, there is the problem that quite literally the code had been compromised. The Americans had broken the code. They did have information coming in. They were able to read their words in some regards, etc. But the thing is, you always have to presume the enemy has some idea of what's going on. So you build that into your force structure. You build that into your formations. You build that into how you allocate force away. But they didn't. Yamato didn't. So let's consider the American planning. The American planning and console operations was kind of simple and straightforward. It's not the big long thing that is for Japan, certainly. It's, we know what the Japanese are going to do. Okay. Now we need to get every bit of resource we can there. Every bit of resource we can there. And that's hard. There is a reason I have a picture here of Yorktown at Pearl Harbor. This is days before the battle. This is her being rebuilt. And literally the criteria is get her ready for roughly 3 to 4 weeks of operations. We will send her to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard as soon as we can. But we need her ready for the next 4 weeks. And the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard get her ready in 72 hours. And this is the point. They also have to find a commander to take on Halsey's role. And they pick Spruance. He'd been acting as Halsey's escort commander. He was capable. You also got Fletcher go out there, and I'll be talking about both these. But honestly, the American planning is, we know where the Japanese are going, we're going to strike them in a way they don't expect. When they don't expect. Because you have to remember, the Japanese, to an extent, are expecting the American hammer to come after they hit Midway. Now, here is the big problem, I would say, with Japanese planning, because they've also done a Gallipoli-style scenario. They've attacked Midway before. They attacked it not long after Pearl Harbor. So they have kind of signaled that it's on their radar. And it's not necessarily a critical base for the US forces at this point. There's not the submarine base and other things that are going to come later. But the thing is, the Americans very much did realize it was on the Japanese radar. It's worthwhile noting that they're able to work out from the Japanese signals they decrypt and from the traffic analysis that Midway is certainly on their radar. They've sent enough bluffs, they've done enough things, they can work it out. So realistically, the American planning is not about how to conduct a massive operation, it's reinforce Midway, and how do we get enough forces there that when the Japanese are hitting, we can hit them harder. And in this scenario, the American planning is far more concentrated force than the Japanese's. Honestly, if the Americans had had their way, I can guarantee Yorktown would have been with Spruance and the task forces would have been combined. Because that makes sense for the Americans. If you consider the assets they're capable of deploying and the escorts again, those carriers need assets. Those carriers are their best weapon for striking back because they can't get a battle fleet there. They can't. So they need those vessels to be able to protect each other and support each other. And the thing about Task Force 17 is, as nice as it has a New Orleans and a Portland class heavy cruisers, two cruisers, and it has 6 destroyers, 5 Sims class and a Gleaves class. That's not a lot of ships. That's a very small escort for a carrier, even at this point. If we consider Task Force 16, in contrast, they have 5 heavy cruisers, a Pensacola, a Northampton, and 3 New Orleans. They have an Atlanta, which is sometimes called an AA cruiser, but as those people who've watched my channel will know, I don't tend to call them AA cruisers. I call them a screening cruiser, because that's what they were. They're about screening the force from surface and subsurface and air threats. And she's good at that. So they have, 6 cruisers with them. So that's 3 per carrier. And then on top of that, they have 9 destroyers. They also have an Oilers group with another 2 destroyers sitting off from it. So yeah, if you think about that, both forces, if you combine those forces, well, if you'd combined them, you would have had 8 cruisers for 3 carriers. You would have had, and this is going to sound particularly sort of fun, you'd have had 15 destroyers for 3 carriers. But instead they're spread between 2 forces, so again, they're weak as well. Right. But again, that's what the Americans are going with what they have available and what they can get there. The Japanese are the plans and putting plans together and setting a timeline. They're the ones sending off forces north, to the north, all sorts of things, and they're sending ships off all over the place for various other operations, which work for them. But again, was that a sensible thing to park 2 Congos with the invasion fleet rather than leave them with the Kido Butai? And the invasion fleet's never going to be moving fast. Does it really need fast battleships? Would it have been better to have taken, one of a couple of battleships from the Northern Expeditionary Force to go back them up? Right, they've got Fuso, Haiga, and Ise and Yamashiro with them. A couple of those would have probably been better. The Americans are throwing everything they have available. If they'd been able to get more available, Nimitz would have found it. If Nimitz had been able to find more, he would have put it into purpose. He really would have. But he wasn't able to. He's got every submarine he can out there. He really does have every submarine he can out there. There are 12 positioned in the Midway Patrol group. 3 in the roving short stops, and 4 in the north of Oahu patrol, just in case the Japanese come down again. And, they are the best submarines he can get his hands on. They are all positioned. The Midway Patrol Group is frankly nasty. It's got 3 Gatos, 5 Tambors, and 4 Nawals. It's just, looking at it as a case of, oh, that's not a group I want to come across. That's not a group I want to deal with. Even the Midway garrison, they show how much the Americans are grabbing everything they can. They have Brewster Buffaloes as part of their air defense force. They have some Wildcats, but they have Buffaloes. The 21 Buffaloes are the core part of the force. Core part of the group. And a whole load of forces sitting there. A whole lot of capabilities positioned around. They also have seaplane tenders, various patrol vessels, various fleet tugs positioned around. They have quite literally put everything they can there to support and sustain their forces. In contrast, the Japanese, who had the ability to select their forces far more, have, I think, made quite a few errors in terms of their assigning and grouping of forces. I had said the Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, If it's going to be your primary shield and sword, supports of the others, it's got to be stronger. It's got to be able to take blows itself and keep on fighting. And that means it needs a heavier escort. It really does. The Americans might not be able to be concentrated because Yorktown's arrival and it being basically built up for operations again in 72 hours of non-stop work in Pearl Harbor. It's a feat which has to be recognized. But the Japanese force... With that being said, shameless book plug time. So Midway. It's a fun one so far. This is kind of the halfway point. We got into the concept of operations, we got into discussions on. We're now going to get into their planning, and then their execution, and then an overall analysis. And this video's been a long one already. It's been a long one already, and this one's gonna be a long one. I'm trying to get to the point where I'm recording 6 videos a week. You know, in between doing other work and other things, and doing the lives and all those things. So it's like sort of recording 6 a week to try and get ahead, get coverage for future events and those things, and it's fun. It is fun. Especially as some of these videos turn out to be a lot longer than I was thinking they were going to be originally. I think this one is already at the hour and 10-minute mark when the Shameless book plug began, and I can't see it being much shorter than a little over 2 hours. I honestly can't see that. But still, I like the premieres. What have I got to talk about in the Shameless book plug? Well, I always use it to say thank you to people who like, share, and subscribe to the channel, who support the channel, who help it grow, and it's the only book I currently have up. More will be coming soon. I also use it to advertise things like if you want to support the channel, membership, patrons, you know, all these things really do help the channel. Ko-fi, literally, that Iron Brew is paid for by Ko-fi. Those packs are £8 each. So the entire Iron Brew supply was actually paid for by someone doing a very nice Ko-fi donation. And literally it was a case of, yep, that's my Iron Brew for a month now. I'm trying to keep to... I've reached the point after pneumonia where I'm allowed... Because I had double pneumonia last year, for those who are watching this channel for the first time, might not know. And that's why sort of occasionally I'm commenting about my health, because unfortunately I had to miss about a month of videos and all sorts of things because of that. Because I was coughing, because I was quite so ill, and it took me a while to get over it, and I spent a long time in accident emergency and other things, and it was not fun. And I'm now back to the point where I'm allowed to exercise more. I'm allowed to go for a walk, an hour a day. I'm allowed to go to do the bike at the gym for half an hour. Not allowed to do any weights yet, cardio only. And I'm allowed to start dieting, whereas previously I was on a rebuild my body's energy supply at the cellular level thing of eat as much as you can. Eat at least 2.5 to 3,000 calories a day if you can. And it was a fun experience, but I'm now able to cut myself down to as long as I don't let myself drop between. I'm allowed to run a deficit a day of roughly 1,000 to 1,500 calories. I cannot be below that level, so that's why I have Iron Brew cans, because if I have eaten my meals and I'm still running a deficit, then I get to treat myself to Iron Brew. I get to have the empty calories of sugar and caffeine as my treat. It works, okay? Some people diet by being very healthy and living off celery. That's never gonna be me. I will eat burgers and have a lovely, no bun, but I'll have the burgers, and I'll have the lovely meal. I'll eat the meat and the nice meat and veg, and then if I have calories left, then I'll treat myself to Iron Brew. It works out. It works out. But the other thing I was going to talk about today is this video is going live at the moment. There is down below, you will see this as the Spreadshirt store. And there should be right at this end, if I've managed to organise it correctly, should be a picture of myself and the senior fluffy research assistant. And basically, they are family dogs. The fluffy research assistants are family dogs. And so I haven't before been allowed to use their pictures on anything I sell. But basically I did that picture together, took a picture I'd taken, photo, turned it in using AI, ChatGPT in this case, turned it into a chibi image and put it together on a background of those sort of things, and I showed it to my mum and went, can I put this one out? And she said, well, it's a test. And luckily you only need 2 votes to win in my family, because there's 3 of us. So 2 votes. In the whole family. So it works. And yeah, so if I can sell 100 of them over a month, I think was what the setting my mum said, and I did point out that we more items than I've ever sold from my Spreadshirt store. Then I get to keep putting up items which include things which include the fluffy research assistants. Starting off with the senior fluffy research assistant makes sense. I've got more pictures of me with him because he's been around for longer and he was around pre-COVID. And so he and I have done all sorts of random travels. We still do random travels. It's more often than not he gets put in my car for the random travels. The Corky travels with the girls. When they go travelling, the Corky goes with them because he's their bodyguard. And anyone who wants to disagree with that has obviously never seen a Corgi in a fight. They look gorgeous, they look lovely dogs, but do not fight them. They have no idea how big they are, and they have no qualms about where they bite. But they're gorgeous and loyal. They really are. With that being said, the Japanese Fleet Command is worthwhile considering some of the people, and some of these are names we're going to be discussing as the battle goes on, and it's worthwhile knowing who they are. It's only when we start to think about the sheer scale of the operation that Yamato was actually conceiving, that he was actually running, start to realise the complexity of it that he wants to put on, of the overall operation, not just the Battle of Midway part, but the overall MI operation. You start to realise that, okay, there's going to be a lot of people involved in this, and then you realise there are a lot of senior officers. There are a lot of senior officers, a lot of different senior people who are going to have to coordinate with each other, who are going to have to be coordinated, who are going to have to be running their constituent parts. And this is just a sample of them, okay? This is just a sample of some of the senior officers involved. These are some of the more preeminent personalities who are going to be talking to each other and trying to work together as this battle unfolds, as this operation unfolds. You've got, of course, Admiral Yamato, who's aboard the Yamato. Got him himself. He's got his Vice Admiral, Matomi Ugaki, who is a talker. Oh, good lord, that man is a talker. He loves to send out signals. He's not on the pictures. He comes up later. Then we have Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who is, of course, the gentleman over there. And he's in charge of the 1st Carrier Division, 1st Fleet Air Fleet. But, of course, they've got the 2nd Carrier Division, which is under Rear Admiral Tamo Yamaguchi as well, to organise and coordinate with. Okay. Alright, so they've got them. And then you've got the 2nd Fleet's main body, which has Vice Admiral Namotoki Kondo in charge, and he's aboard the Atago. Alright, and then you've got the 3rd Battleship Division under Vice Admiral Gunishi Mikawa aboard the Congo. Okay. There you go. There's a Congo sitting there. I haven't included the battle squadron in the 1st Air Fleet. I should have probably included them as well, just to point out where the battleships are. And then there's the Midway Occupation Force, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, and then the Midway Support Force, Vice Admiral Takia Kurita, and the Advanced Submarine Force, which is Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, who's aboard the Katori, back at Kwajalein Atoll. And they're all talking to each other. They all have to an extent, talk and coordinate with each other. And yes, people are going to go, well, they're on emission silence. Yeah, you can be on emission silence in one unit, but the nicest way, the rest are still needing to work around you. That's the trouble when you have a more complicated force, when you have a wider force. If you concentrated this force in one group, if you concentrated the entire Japanese fleet in one combined force, you'd slow down the pace of maneuver of the carriers, yes, but there wouldn't have to be any radio communications to actually coordinate them, because they could coordinate by signal lamp and flag. You see, this is the problem you get to when you're trying to do operations. You either have to make sure the units are going to be completely independent and therefore don't need to talk to each other, or you have to try and bring them together, because otherwise they are going to make noise. Why do we still have signal lamps on ships to this day? Because ultimately it's a communication system which the enemy can't really track unless they are very close. In which case, there's a problem. There's other problems, but we'll leave that to one side. We still have signal lamps. There keeps being a debate coming around at times to use flags again, because it works. It works. And that's the thing. It's a system which cannot be easily intercepted by the enemy unless they're in the right place. Unless they are in the right place. And, of course, we have satellite communications, but that runs into the whole thing of satellite bandwidth. I know, something which was never considered when satellites were first created, but there is a difference in that, a difficulty in them, in that they are not infinite. There is a reason 99% of the world's internet traffic goes by undersea cables, not by satellites. No matter how much work Starlink and Elon Musk and all the other companies which are doing and starting down that process do, the overwhelming amount of data still flows by undersea cables, because there is a limit to how much you can ping up and ping down. There is a limit per unit at our current technological level. Who knows, we might sometimes be that. But the point is, the Japanese plan, if we go back to their whole concept of operations and their whole fleet, requires so much coordination. It requires so many of these forces to talk and communicate with each other. And some of these men, some look very certain in their photos. Some look very nice in their photos. Some look very grumpy. But a fair number of them do not look very decisive individuals. And that's the other problem with the Japanese fleet command system. Because not everyone, and this is, to be fair, a problem in all navies, you have usually two forms of naval officers. The ones who won't do anything wrong because they do exactly what they're told and no more, and the ones who interpret their commands and get things right. The ones who get things wrong tend to get kicked out of the service. Now, there are problems throughout World War II with officers in the former camp who will do exactly what they're told when they cause trouble by not transmitting information or by asking too many questions. The Germans and the Japanese specifically suffer from a lot of the latter. They have officers who need to have their hands held by senior officers, because that's the command system they've been raised in, because they're worried about making things going wrong, and the consequences if they go wrong. In contrast, when we go to the American Fleet Command, it's rather sparse. Honestly, it's rather small, and you'll notice it's kind of concentrated. There are two of them are literally sitting in Hawaii and can talk to each other face to face if they need to. That's Nimitz and Robert English. I do love that the US Navy, when they need to find a submarine commander, they turn to the English. I know, bad joke. Okay, bad joke. And the guy actually did a very good job at certain points in the war. He was not as successful as always with dealing with Bureau ordnance, but he certainly tried his best, and certainly tried his best for his submarine crews. And then you have Fletcher, and you have Spruance. Now, I gave you a sample of the Japanese command structure. This is the entire American command structure. This is it. Yes, they have chiefs of staff. Yes, they have subordinate commanders with them. But as far as anyone needs to know, the communications routes are going to go between these 4 commands, of which it's going to be 2 talking to 1, and these 2 will just talk to each other in person. And the thing is, again, when it comes to their communication, when it comes to their talking, well, they need to do less. Because basically, it's get to Midway, find the Japanese, attack. It's not coordinate a whole lot of amphibious forces. Not you are the defence force for the amphibious task group, my battle group coming through this group, that group. That's not it. There's no interlocking. These are literally get there, find Japanese, kill them. Respond to any problems from Midway. And that's the other advantage they have. Midway is already there, is already operating, it's reconnaissance, all these things. And that means they can do this. They have the information coming in. It allows them to be far more quiet, far more unobserved. And that's ultimately a massive advantage. A massive advantage in this battle. It truly is. And the thing is, again, there are more officers I can list. There are more pictures I can put in. I could overload the slides. I could do 3 slides like this full of pictures of the Japanese command structure and the disparate or groups trying to coordinate with each other. And then I can do this for the Americans. Does this say one is right, one is wrong? One methodology is right, one is wrong? Not really. No. What it does mean is that the Japanese are trying to do a very complicated operation. And they're doing their approach to it, Yamato's approach to it. And I think, and as I said, I compare it to MB8. I compare it to the similar operation in terms of complexity of moving parts going around. The problem I see with the Japanese system and the Japanese methodology is they almost try to be too clever. And they didn't factor in enough of what their opponent might do. It comes to something when you don't give your opponent enough agency. And one way is that's because they're limited, they can't afford to. They don't have enough force and don't have enough infrastructure to be able to really countenance their opponent doing much because they can't really adjust. But at this point, they have such a large force structure. All they needed was to rework things a bit. Realistically, what should they have done? They should have had their northern group all centered together. They should have had their Midway force centered together, and they should have had their amphibious force behind their Midway force if they want to. So they should have had 3 of these forces, if they really needed to do that. And have the Midway amphibious force, they are coming along behind, and they proceed to a certain schedule. And the faster force, the strike force, formed around the Kido Butai, but with a lot more escorts, a lot more capital ships, a lot more go forward and go do the fight, if they think there's going to be a fight. And as I said, I'm tempted to believe they rather didn't expect the American fleet to show up till after they'd invaded Midway. I do think, and reading the books, you get difference in opinions from other historians, and I like that, because in many ways you're trying to figure out what they're really thinking, and a lot of them end up dead. A lot of the Japanese officers involved end up dead, so you can't be 100% sure, because there's, again, and this is extent with everyone, but it's also very true in Japan, and in Japan when it could have lethal consequences, you can really understand why. You have your public face, your private face, and your personal face. You have what you know inside you. You have what you present to your close friends, who you are very, very close friends and family. And then there's what you portray yourself in public. And a lot of what is written in documents is public face. A lot of what is written is public face. And that's always a problem when it comes to analysing things. It's one of the things you learn when you're starting to look through documents. start to analyse the tone being used, and the more formal people are, the more public face this document is. The more formal, it's the more public face. And therefore you have to think about it. They are writing this not just for their friends because it's their opinion or their colleagues. They're writing it because it could be read by others who might use it against them. And that means you have to be careful about the analysis. You have to think it through and go, well, yes, let's hedge this, or does this completely make sense if you work through? And I often feel like the things that the stuff they have about being confronted by the Americans before or as they're invading Midway is more pro forma. It's not what they expect. They expect the Americans to show up later. They expect Americans to not realise they're coming till they've hit Midway, till they've taken Midway, till they've secured Midway, because they'll be there and they'll have an advantage of them. It's 1,200 nautical miles. It's a long way. In the nicest way, they expect to be able to get that done and have squashed whatever garrison there is in Midway far more quickly before the Americans actually arrive, before their fleet actually arrives. With that being said, though, let's look at how the battle actually unfolds. And of course, we're looking at it from a leadership perspective, which means leadership decisions start to really add up here. Now, in contrast to Yorktown, which had been damaged and has to be repaired, Carrier Division 5, which had been Shukaku and Zukaku for the Japanese, Shukaku had been lost. Zukaku still survived. So did a large chunk of Shukaku's air group and Zukaku's air group, a large chunk of it. But because they didn't have a complete air group, they didn't deploy Zukaku. They didn't deploy that 5th carrier, which would have been a 20%, more than a 20% increase in force capability. Now, I contrast this decision with taking the instructors from the Yokosuka Air Corps. The Yokosuka Air Corps. To support their air groups. And I realise there are many who point out the reason they didn't do the Shikaku-Zukaku air group combined is because of doctrine. And I agree, they don't. But they also have a working frigating carrier, and they break their doctrine to bring out their frigating instructors, who are trying to plug the gaps in their air groups, which are falling apart because of their losses, and they don't break their doctrine in this way. And that is one of the reasons why I have the suspicions I do about the operational planning. Because if you really think you're going into a big battle, why are you prepared to break your doctrine in one way and not break your doctrine in the other? That's the question. And this is why they don't have Zukaku with them. They still have a hefty force. They still have a very hefty force of nearly 250 aircraft. But it would have been useful. They would have had over 300, probably, if they had had with them Zukaku. And that makes a difference. It does. It's that extra strike. It's that extra weight of strike. It's that extra scout aircraft. It's those extra capabilities. And this is over and above the fact that, as I've said before, due to their planning of making this a very complicated mastervoka of an operation, they haven't got enough forces there. And I realise some will say that even if they had more cruisers, more destroyers, more capital ships with those carriers, they'd still have a glass jaw, as Mark Peaty actually describes it quite beautifully, because their AA is just not as good. True. But they'd have a lot more of it. And the thing is, we don't say quantity is a quality all of its own for no reason. It is. And even bad AA in enough volume causes trouble. And if you have enough ships there, it also disperses the attack. So imagine there's a 5th carrier that people can get distracted by. Imagine there's the extra 2 Congos there. Imagine there's more cruisers there. There's all these things which are going to distract the pilots and spread their attacks out more. Because pilots are pilots. They go after the biggest target they can see closest to them. They're humans too. It While still some are going to be hunting and are going to be really desirous to try and track down and hit the flat tops, there are going to be many who are going to be distracted by the cruisers, the big the Congos, which I know sort of are sometimes called battleships by the Japanese, but let's be honest, they are battle cruisers. With a couple of them have possibly followed across the line into fast battleships because of their subdivision that they've added in modifications and the way their armor worked in the first place. But still, they are upgraded Tigers. That is what they are, pretty much in design. World War One battle cruisers. But it still draws fire. And this is the beginning of a whole series of decisions in this operation made by both sides which have an impact on it. And please note, this battle, we're going to be talking about the decisions going through it. I'm not doing a step-by-step of the battle, we're talking about the decisions. It gets worse as we go on, some decisions, because we have to consider the fact that the Japanese aircraft involved aren't getting replaced as regularly as their American counterparts. They're not even getting replaced and repaired as frequently as their British counterparts. The British aircraft in the Mediterranean, some of the Japanese carriers would have loved to have had the spare supply, which the British carriers at the other end of the Mediterranean were receiving from Britain. There's serious problems in their production. Some production of some of their strike aircraft has stopped completely by this point. Because they're trying to move on to the next generation aircraft, but they haven't got them enough numbers, so they're still using the older ones, and they're not repairing them and supporting them properly. They really aren't. They have, as said before, issues in terms of a lack of radar, but the biggest issue was they've tried to deploy multiple scouting positions. First thing was going to be a picket line of submarines. Unfortunately, they didn't get in position till too late because the operation was kind of rushed. As said, the Japanese, Yamato's trying to take back the initiative. They're trying to take back control of the tune of the war. And they are rushing to do it. And so the American carriers have actually managed to move through before the Japanese have got into position. It's quite literally a definition of closing the barn door after the horses have fled the stable. They have. The other scenario they were using for reconnaissance was an H-8K Emily flying boat, one of their big 4-engine flying boats. And they'd done this before. Unfortunately, because they'd done it before, and there had been signals traffic analysis, the Americans knew where they would go to. They knew they'd go to French frigate shoals. That's where they detected the signals before. So they were patrolling it. So the submarines which were supposed to refuel the aircraft there couldn't refuel it there because they saw the Americans were there and couldn't go in. Because this literally American warships sitting there going, hello? And to get into French frigate shoals, you can't do it underwater. You have to, because of the shallowness, the submarine has to come up to a point which they're going to be visible. A lot further away than they can necessarily torpedo their opponent, even with long lances, in that scenario. But the guns of the American warships can engage them. So, the Japanese have lost the information and intelligence battle at this point. And then things get worse. Okay. So, Tokyo is receiving where all the intelligence is going to. The intelligence is going back to the ministry in Tokyo. They're getting all detail. And they detect and get intercepts of American submarine activity. They've got their own signals traffic analysis going on. They're detecting the maneuver of submarines. And they send the information out to Yamato. And Yamato looks at it and goes, I don't want to change the plans, but our forces should be careful. He is quite correct in his belief that Nagumo gets the same signal from Tokyo. But Nagumo doesn't alter his plans, take any precautions at all either. And Yamamoto doesn't signal him because he doesn't wish to reveal his position. Now, you might have noticed I spoke earlier about communications between the forces and them talking to each other. Them not talking to each other and assuming what each other do is just as much a communication issue as them communicating. Communicating reveals positions, but not communicating and assuming that others are going to act means that you are not coordinating your forces. You have a breakdown in coordination because Yamamoto is taking precautions and presuming his subordinates will do the same. Now, he does actually have a carrier with him. And theoretically, with an idea of where the Kida Butai is, he could have theoretically sent a message by pilot to be flown to Nagumo and have them fly back, etc. But again, that would cause issues with the carrier groups and coordination, and it might not work. So if he really didn't want a radio intercept or send out a radio communication, there are options, but it's not done. It is not done. Next, we have the other problem in intelligence battle, and the other intelligence issue, which is going to be critical to this operation, is the fact that the Japanese, whilst they had a new code, had not implemented in time. Because again, they're rushing the operation. They had a new code. If they'd implemented it before the battle and before the operation, which would have been sensible, especially for these forces and the communications about this operation, then the Americans would have been in more trouble. A lot more trouble. It would have taken them a while to crack it. Furthermore, I'd like to point out that at no level of this leadership chain, and the intelligence chain, and the analysis chain, has anyone in Japan figured out that, hang on, the Americans broadcast as a trick to work out what their target was, a signal, an uncoded signal about water purification system. Now you might think, oh, it doesn't matter, they're super confident. But the thing is, intelligence officers are paid to be paranoid. Intelligence officers are supposed to ask the question, not am I paranoid, but am I paranoid enough? They are literally the ones who you pay to try and think like the enemy and presume the enemy is trying to trick you and to figure out what that trick is. Now again, this one tends to come up as a point of people using it to critique the Japanese and call them stupid. I would not agree with that assessment. I would say the Japanese know they're on borrowed time already in this war. The trouble is, most of the senior people fighting this war, especially on the naval side, know they cannot win. They are trying to roll the dice the best they can to buy their government and nation time. In fact, when you realize the large number of Japanese officers who go into the war knowing they can't win but thinking it's the only option because they either fight a war and maybe get destroyed, but at least they have a chance of surviving, or they don't fight a war and their way of life, their culture will be destroyed. That's their belief. I'm not saying it's true, but that's their belief, that's their view of the Americans and the West and what they've been doing, what they're going to do to them. I think, therefore, they are target fixated, and with that in mind, this is their best option for trying to get back control. They are looking for reasons to do it, not necessarily for reasons against it. They are looking for it as an opportunity. They're looking for it as a good thing, that the shortage of water is probably going to degrade the American troops' fighting ability. The American forces on the islands' fighting ability. If they're short of water, if they're short water rations, it's a good thing. They're not thinking, hang on, this is quite an important piece of information. Why wasn't this broadcast in code? Why is this broadcasted open communications? And so all this adds up to the American decision makers have a fairly accurate idea of the Japanese order of battle and of their positioning and organization. The Japanese have a completely inaccurate idea of what the Americans are doing and lack a lot of knowledge about them. And they aren't exercising enough caution. And then we're going to see this as the decisions of the battle go on, because everything gets worse. Next decisions happen really on the 3rd of June. You might be going, Alex, the 3rd isn't here. Well, the 3rd of June is important. And this is about, again, communication between the different forces. What is the Sword and Shield of Force? It is the 1st Air Fleet. So Nagumo needs to hear things. At 0900 hours on the 3rd of June, a PBY flown by Ensign Jack Reed from VP 44, the US Navy's patrol squadron, spots the Japanese occupation force. Roughly 500 nautical miles from Midway. Now there's a mistake. It's reported as the main force, and B-17s take off from Midway at 12:30 hours and do an air attack. They actually find Tanaka's transport group, and instead, they don't. It's fun. And they drop some bombs. There's AA fire. Their crews report hitting ships, but they don't. They miss them. None were hit. You know, it's level bombing of a fleet maneuvering. Even a slow merchant vessel can get out of the way and go, oh, great, yeah. They're not factories, they move. In fact, it's not till 0100 hours on the 4th that the Akebono Maru sustains a hit from a torpedo launched by a PBY. It's the only actual successful air torpedo attack launched by the US during a battle. But here's the thing. That means they were attacked at 12:30 hours on the 3rd of June. And no one seems to make the decision, hang on, the ruse is up, they know we're coming. Perhaps we should concentrate our protective fire. Perhaps we should organize ourselves. Perhaps we should change our formation. Perhaps we should start with the gigs up. They're here. They know we're coming. No! They carry on. They carry on. It's just so silly at this point. You know, you've literally been attacked. You literally know the enemy knows you're coming. They've started hitting your groups. And this is why I find it funny also when we start talking about the battle. We usually started off at 04:30 hours on the 4th of June. But realistically, we should probably be starting it from 0900 hours on the 3rd of June. But the trouble is, if you start it from that point, if you start it from what is... Now, you might have noticed I haven't spoken much about the Americans so far. That's because, honestly, in decision-making process, they haven't had to do much. They are being extremely courteous to their opponent. After all, you should never interrupt your enemy when he's making mistakes. And Nagumo is about to make a lot of them. You see, that force which had been retained back, which was loaded with torpedo bombers loaded with torpedoes, and the dive bombers not loaded with anything, because the dive bombers get loaded with their bombs on the deck. Nagumo now decides, you know what, I'm going to rearm these to attack my land targets. Why? They've been ordered to be set up to retain the case's aircraft. My scout aircraft to start hunting. But no, I'm going to jump the gun. For some reason, Nagumo decides to be proactive. He decides to be proactive. And that's a problem. That is a real problem. You see, the Japanese have a policy, a doctrine, which is rather similar to their American counterparts. When you're launching the Americans and Japanese doctrine is very similar on this front. It's if we are launching a strike on enemy carriers, we want to launch a fully weighted strike and alpha strike. Now, the British doctrine is always, if you find the enemy, hit them with whatever you have available and just keep hitting them. The enemy are there. Good. Hit them. What do we have available? Hit them. Hit them. Hit them. Hit them. The British entire philosophy of carrier doctrine and carrier warfare is the whole time. Whereas the American and Japanese is wham, 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 wham. Sorry, a bit active, but that's basically gives you the idea of it. It's literally, it's weighted punches versus lots of little punches. No, that's the scenario. I know you want to get involved, but no, we're not showing off the paws of fury. They are far too dangerous weapons. Keep the paws of fury under control, my fluff. Until they're needed. Okay, good boy. You can have a biscuit. And the thing is, this is going to cause more complications, because if you start disarming and rearming aircraft, it takes time. And 30 minutes later comes in the report from one of their scout aircraft, we've spotted an American carrier. Oh, frigate. Or rather, we've spotted an American carrier force. And that's the point they're halfway starting to rearm, and go halfway through it pretty much. You know, taking the torpedoes off the torpedo bombers and adding more bombs to them. And then that signal finally reaches Nagumo about 0800 hours. And Nagumo, instead of launching the aircraft he has with the capabilities they have and the weapons they're loaded with, no, they've got to be properly armed, they've got to be properly launched. He wants a composition of the force, and takes about half an hour for them to report the carriers in the force. So he's got the carrier details about 8:30. It's Task Force 16 they spotted, by the way. And by this point, the aircraft are all still being in the process of being rearmed, but they're now armed with land attack weapons. And he decides, oh no, they need to be rearmed again. If you think about it, if he hadn't ordered this rearming, if he hadn't ordered these changes at 07:15 hours, when the reports come in at 07:40, he could have launched all those aircraft. He could have launched 140 aircraft. Give or take. Probably at least another 108. He could have launched all those aircraft at Task Force 16. And it would have been devastating. It would have been devastating. The problem is, though, that all this has been going on, all these decisions have been going on, and the American strike has already been launched. The Americans know where he is. They found him. Their PBYs found him ages ago. Enterprise had launched, along with Hornet, had launched their aircraft at 07:55 hours. Between 07 and 07:55. Take an hour to get all the aircraft up between the two carriers. Yorktown, she got all the aircraft airborne roughly 9:10. They're already on their way. The aircraft are already on their way. And he hasn't got a strike up. You could argue he's strictly following his carrier doctrine, but honestly, he's not. He's being an idiot. Or rather, he's not even being an idiot. Nagumo is one of those naval officers who strictly follows his instructions. He does exactly what he's told. He is literally plugging A and B into the document and taking out C. He's not adapting. He's not an adaptive officer. He is the perfect tool for someone like Yamamoto to have in command of his force, as long as he's able to communicate with him, as long as he's able to control him. This is the ultimate problem of splitting up the forces. This is the ultimate issue, because this is a complicated operation, and you need someone who's adaptive to be in command. Someone who can react to the situations. Not someone who has gone, well, I don't know, haven't heard of a carrier yet, and the island is still attacking me, so I will now reconfigure my force. Oh, now I've known of a carrier, I must therefore reconfigure my reconfigure my force. It's back to going to attack a carrier. No. No. And everything after this is pretty much how she wrote it for the Japanese. The strikes hit. They are devastating. They have been tough decisions getting there. Very tough decisions. Both admirals had weighty ideas about whether or not they launched their strikes or not because of the distances, and because of, they're getting information from a PBY. They're at extreme ranges. This is going to be a dangerous. But the American admirals launched their strikes. It's better to fire your shot than to have it on the deck when you hit. That's both American and Japanese doctrine. The Japanese doctrine, though, and this is why, again, I don't like it being said that Nagumo is following their doctrine in full, because he's not. He's cherry picking. He's following doctrine, yes, but he's cherry picking which parts of it. He'd be an even more confused state if he tried to follow all of it, because he follows instructions. He doesn't necessarily adapt to circumstance. They take off. They hit. And the aircraft that hit, well, the big decision the Americans took, and this comes mostly from Spruance, is that instead of waiting for the carrier groups, the aircraft to form up into their big striking multi-force, multi-type groups, no, as soon as a squadron was launched, go. They were channeling British doctrine more than American doctrine. And there's a reason for that, because, again, the American attacks needed to go in. And whilst not being coordinated would increase their casualties and diminish the overall potency, the fact is, if you hit them first and hit them hardest, as quickly as possible, you prevent their counterstrikes. And you also might hit them when the aircraft, the Midway strike aircraft, are landing back on the carriers, for Nagumo's carriers. And that is ultimately what happens, because that's the other thing Nagumo runs into. All this indecision means that by the time he's making decisions of the aircraft what to do, and is trying to rearm his aircraft, the Midway strike is returning and landing. Again, if he'd never made that decision, he could have launched a strike. He would have had space on his decks to recover the aircraft coming in when the Midway strike came in. He would have been in a far better position to deal with the air attacks, to deal with all the problems that come in. Even with the glass jaw that was his AA guns and his lack of escorts. But that wasn't to be. That wasn't to be. And the battle from this point, there's no leadership involved. Not really. They're getting hit. Launching strikes as they can. It's attack, react, attack. The admirals have thrown their bits in. They have made their decisions now. It's just a time to watch their officers work. Anything they do, anything they try and get involved in is just going to add complications and make it more difficult. And so they don't. And the Americans win a battle. They win a big battle. The Japanese lose all 4 fleet carriers. A heavy cruiser. And that's a lot of force to lose, especially when they have less ability to replace them and less ability to repair it. the Americans lose a fleet carrier and a destroyer. And the entire losses of the carrier force can be put down to, in my mind, for the Japanese, can be put down to the fact that they didn't coordinate with the main force. They didn't bring up the main force and coordinate in with the carriers and just go, right then, the Americans know we're coming. They could have done that on the 3rd of January. The Americans know we're coming. We're going to concentrate our weighty blow. We're going to concentrate our escorts. We're going to concentrate our firepower. That they didn't bring Zukaku was stupid beyond the extreme, but leave that to one side. And I'd say the big thing is that decision Nagumo's. It really is. But this gets us into why the mistakes were made, and I've sort of already gotten at that, but I want to go into it in more detail. Now, you might get from this idea that all the mistakes were made on the Japanese part, and no, there are mistakes made by the Americans. There are some mistakes made by the Americans. I would say myself, there is a for and against of concentrating the carrier task groups. There is a for and against. If you concentrate them together, they are mutually able to support each other. If they're separated, they are divided targets. It's a hard one to really second guess. And with the difference in times of operations of Yorktown, etc., with its issues getting there, I can, in many ways, I have to accept that they made the right decision. I do have to. I just don't think necessarily it was the right decision. I think, whilst I don't like to second guess these things too much, I honestly think those two task groups 16 and 17, should have pushed, Force 16 and 17 should have pulled together more. I think the mutual fire support they'd have been able to give each other, and I think the capabilities that would have been able to work of getting the three carriers would have completely outweighed the increased risks of them being together and therefore being in one place, I suppose. But yeah, that's life. Realistically, this decisive battle, and it was a decisive battle from the American side, it was a Kantai-Kesed from their perspective, because they knock out quite so much of the Japanese force. It's made possible by the speed with which the Japanese are trying to execute it, to try and, as I keep saying, get back control of the tune of the war. But also, and this has to be considered in quite a lot of detail, the repeated failures of command, control, and coordination of their higher command. Yes, talking with each other once you're at sea would reveal your positions. It would. But not talking with each other when you're at sea leads to this. It's a really tough road to row. It really is. But you have to figure it out. You have to think, what do we do? How do we manage this? I think ultimately the best compromise would have been if they'd concentrated on fewer but larger forces than they did historically. I think if we go back to the command structure for the Japanese, and we think about it again, all those forces that are not tucked in, like the battleship and the carrier division, so 3rd Battleship Division, the 2nd Carrier Division, all those forces are their own separate force. That's a problem. You have a main force and you have the 1st Air Fleet. That should not have been the case. They should have been combined together. And the Second Fleet, the invasion force, they should have been together. They should have been a solid force structure. They should have been mutually supporting. And they should have, in the nicest way, the Second Fleet, the invasion force, should have been well behind. Well behind the main force, not off to one side. What does it do if you do that? What does it change if you combine your forces? Well, for starters, Nagumo has someone to ask, what do I do about my carriers aircraft? Should I rearm them? And I'm going to guess Yamamoto would probably go, no. Instead of consulting the doctrine, he has his senior officer to consult. What does that change in things? Well, also, if you combine the two forces together, you have more reconnaissance aircraft. You have more of the air cruisers and the capital ships with their scout aircraft, and that's part of Japanese doctrine, that those are the aircraft used for scouting. So you have more scout aircraft go off probably early in the morning to go out hunting for the Americans. More information to possibly get back in. Yeah, that helps. And then when the American aircraft do come in, if they do come in the piecemeal attacks that they historically did, then you've got more air defenses. There was a question put to me once by a student when I was talking through the Battle of Midway film, which was, what happens if they just took Zukaku with them as a fighter carrier? If they go, well, the doctrine says we don't want a carrier with, only half an air grip, but we've got a lot of fighters, we can take it with us as a fighter carrier, and we use her as provide an extra strong cap, an extra strong shield. It's actually a good idea. But that's the thing is, again, the Japanese don't see that as an option. They don't even conceive that as an option. And again, this comes down to some of the source analysis when we're looking through Fushida and other sources available. What they don't tell us, what they don't say, is as much information as what it is, what they do. Again, personal accounts like that, you also remember they're the personal perspective on their recollections of their memories. So you always have to put it through that phrasing. This is their personal perspective on what they recollect. It's a perspective on events. And it's one of those few times when we start talking about things and we sound very interesting because it's their truth. So when people say, oh, this source is lying, I'm always very cautious. Always very cautious to say this source is lying. They're not. They're giving their perspective on their recollections. Its level of factual accuracy may differ. But you combine it with other sources, you build up an image. You build up an understanding of what was going on. By what the sources have in them, what they don't have in them, and how they discuss what they do have in them. All of that allows you to build up an image. And what you get is a Japanese high command which is very, very committed to getting back control of the war, and are very much trying to set up an operation which is complicated enough it should disperse any American forces that are available to respond to the various actions going on, preventing them concentrating. And they are doing this in such a way that therefore there is rules for them to follow, and they're expecting them to follow. What's even worse with this is that if Nagumo had followed the instructions laid down by Yamamoto, he would have been in a better position. The biggest problem comes with the strikes in terms of not being able to get strikes off against the Americans, comes because he actually tried to be an adaptive commanding officer, and think for himself. Not on a tactical level, he does that. I'm not claiming he's a dolt who just does exactly what he's told. No, on a strategic level. Once you start rearming strike aircraft and changing around formations, that's strategic discussions and debates. And Nagumo is a very good tactical officer. He's a very good officer to put in command of a force and execute someone's plan. He's not necessarily going to make the strategic decisions. In this case, because he gets... Some people blame it on that aircraft, that B-26 hitting his bridge and almost killing him, so it makes him vengeful against Midway. I don't think so. I think he's getting cocky. I think he's thinking that he wants to move up in the world, and I think he's thinking that the Americans couldn't have got any carriers here because they didn't know we were coming, which the data coming in suggests they did. And the Americans will only respond after we've taken the islands, so there's no real risk of carriers being here. So I might as well launch another strike on the islands and completely eliminate their air threat, and then we'll just... Well, it'll be more work for the occupation force, but I don't care about them. They're not part of my force structure. Not part of my force structure. Not my problem, Gov. I've heard that too many times in my life. And it's, in a way, problematic because there are so many opportunities in this battle that it could have been an actual decisive battle for the Japanese in getting time. Taking Zukaku, keeping the main force and the Kirabatai together so they're mutually supporting, and so that Yamamoto can look over Nagumo's shoulder and go, nope. All those things could have made a huge difference in the overall outcome of the battle. Instead of it being 4 Japanese carriers lost, it could have quite easily be 3 American carriers lost, and our discussion could be, in this battle, could be the Americans chucked them in. They tried to spring a trap on a Japanese trap, and the Japanese trap worked. And especially could be. Now, so if we consider the piecemeal nature of the attacks, ordered by sprints, etc., there is an advantage in that you're getting the attacks off, but there is also a disadvantage in that those attacks coming in, the Japanese AA and the Japanese, fighter defense, they're not going to be overwhelmed. They can manage piecemeal attacks coming in. It's going to cause them to have to rearm and go back to the flight deck and recircle around. But as long as you're not halfway through rearming a strike and the landing of your first strike, it should actually be quite a manageable situation. It should be. But because you, Nagumo, have tried to be adaptive yourself, it's not. It's just not. Now, before we get into the lessons learned, and that is where this is going, I always love this line from Naval Strategy in Pacific, December 1941 to February 1943, from the British Naval Staff History of the Second World War. Battle Summary number 25. You can get a copy if you want, on The Rise of the Aircraft Carrier from the British Maritime Museum, Britannia Museum Trust Press. It's always interesting, but it does end up with this on the subject of the Battle of Midway Island, as they were calling at that point. Not the Battle of Midway. Battle of Midway Island. Once more, the strategic situation in the Pacific had undergone a dramatic change, this time to the advantage of the Allies. The Japanese carrier strength was, for the time being, reduced to Zukaku, 23,000 tons, 2 small carriers, and 3 converted merchant ships. This meant that Japan had lost the initiative, the threat to India was definitely removed, and an opportunity offered to the Allies to pass to the offensive strategy in the Pacific, which has been steadily pursued to the present day. It's lovely, isn't it? The battle, which was supposed to stop the Japanese losing control of the tune, actually hands it fully over to the Allies. So what are the lessons learned? Well, I'd say... what are the lessons learned from a leadership perspective? You need information. You need information. You need to listen to information when it comes in. You need to think it through. And you do need to react to events. You can't expect to stay there. No, there's the phrase, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But honestly, you also have to think, why was this plan in place in the first place? Why was there this decision? Why were we supposed to keep these aircraft back? What was the reality of this? What was our overriding criteria? I'd also say, if you're in a situation where you're already abandoning doctrine to the extent that you are doing something such as disrupting your training cycles by taking instructors away from their training center, you have to consider, what other areas of doctrine do I consider necessary to abandon for this situation? A carrier and, roughly 2/2 of air groups sitting out an operation because it's not trying not to combine them? What are you doing? What happened to you? Why? Basically. Why? It gets worse as we start to look through the lessons learned, because some of them are really obvious. And I'd say the biggest one is, it's best to hit with what you have when you what you have available when you can, than to necessarily try and wait for the perfect circumstance. Time is a factor in conflicts. Timing is critical, but time itself, as in the time that elapses, is always a factor. Information has value for a certain amount of time until the situation changes. By continually waiting for the perfect, by rearming, then re-rearming, by all the dithering, the Japanese did themselves out of this battle. They did themselves out of this situation. You look at the results, and you can understand why some people walk away from studying this battle and thinking that the Japanese never had a chance to win. They could never win. There's no chance they could win. Their aircraft were, they didn't have their air groups up to snuff. There was all sorts of maintenance issues going on. They had shortages of pilots. They had all these things. They could never win Midway, and that's wrong. They could. That's why Midway is such an important battle. They could win it. They could have won it handedly if they followed their plan to an extent, but also if they'd actually given their enemy agency and they'd given time for things to take place. Making a decision to rearm the aircraft at 07:15 when your reconnaissance aircraft haven't got out nearly far enough is way too early. It's impatience. It just is. It should have been waiting till about 0800 hours, at the earliest, to make that decision. And then you'd think, well, hang on, how long is it going to take us to rearm our aircraft and launch our aircraft in their new configuration? And what can happen in that time? And when's the strike returning? And all these things need to be figured out because timing matters. And then when you hear of it, well, why are you just not launching the aircraft you have available? Because you want to wait for the perfect strike. Timing matters. Leadership, and a lot of leadership, is not just about when to follow orders, when to follow a plan, when to break them. It's also to judgment as to when things are best done. And it's very easy to follow doctrine. Following doctrine means that if things go wrong, you're not at fault. Doctrine is that wonderful get-out-of-jail-free card. Well, you can't really define me as doing the wrong thing, because I was following doctrine. I was following the rules. I got my force wiped out, but I was following doctrine. Yes, you're following doctrine, and you got your force wiped out. But there are whole chunks in that doctrine, whole sections in that doctrine, about evaluating it on your own actions, your own thoughts. And here is the really stupid thing. Because by this point, they knew the Americans knew they were there because they're literally being attacked, he could have radioed and asked for instructions. It wouldn't be giving away his position now, would it? They already know where he is. He could have radioed and asked for instructions. Okay, yes, that might have revealed where Yamamoto was. The main force never has any problems. But as I've said before, I think the biggest lesson you have to learn from this is it's better to sometimes concentrate your force. It's better to concentrate your force, because then they can support each other. Then they are a capable group as a whole. Because you take that main force and you combine it. You combine it with the rest of with the forces going on, and suddenly you have a lot of capabilities. You take that main force, you combine it with the first the Kido Butai, the first air fleet. You have a lot more firepower to help you deal with the Americans. You have a lot more adaptability. You have okay, yes, not much of an improvement from a glass jaw, but maybe you have a wooden jaw. It can be burnt and axed through, but, you know, it's going to last a little bit more. It's not a fireproof door, just a wooden jaw, okay? Maybe we'll go possibly balsa wood? No, a little bit stronger than balsa wood. But you get the point. There were decisions made the whole way through this operation by people who would want to direct the strategies of wars and would be expected to make the decisions and strategies of wars. They're supposed to have the experience and knowledge to be able to do that. And yet, the whole way through, they're not giving their enemy agency. And they're not thinking through the consequences of their timing. They're not thinking through the consequences of their timing. I can understand racing the strike when you have the theory that the Americans are down to 2 carriers because Yorktown's so damaged. I can understand that one. But in the same scenario, if you're racing, even if you do think they're down to 2 carriers, you're leaving a 5th carrier behind. 2-to-1 odds sound good. 5-to-2 odds sound great. And then if the Americans do surprise you, if something does appear from somewhere else, if they do pull a rabbit out the hat, guess what? You have also. Because they're not going to be expecting 5 carriers. Well, they might be. especially as you haven't changed your code, and a basic assumption of war should be that your enemy has cracked your code after you've been using it for a certain amount of time. If in doubt, if you're using it for this long, the enemy's cracked your code. There are many different encryption methodologies that are used today. Many different encryption technologies that are used today, and lots of systems out there. But if in doubt, if you've been using it for longer than a couple of months, presume it's cracked and your enemy's reading everything. It's just easier that way. It is. It is just easier that way. With that being said, I always finish my videos with a question. And I want to flip this on its head a bit. Let's say the Japanese get everything right. Let's say the Japanese do concentrate their main fleet and their carrier battle group, as I've suggested, and they do bring along the Zukaku, not as my student one suggested as a fighter carrier, just as a combining the Shikaku and Zukaku air groups to provide a suitable air group. And let's say they don't have the rearming and re-rearming of the strike group and actually launch it. Let's say, therefore, the Americans lose not one carrier, but 2 carriers. And the Japanese, let's say, also lose a couple of carriers. But the Japanese get to take Midway. How do you think that changes things? What do you think happens? What do you think the memory of Midway would be as today? What do you think the memory of it would be as today? And the reason I reckon 2 carriers rather than 1 is because my theory is if they launch their strike earlier, the carriers they know the whereabouts of are Task Force 16. And Task Force 16 is Enterprise and Hornet. And as good as those carriers are, as survivable as Enterprise is, as charmed a life as she leads, I'd say if you have enough aircraft coming in, over 100 aircraft, and it would be more because you'd have the aircraft from Zukaku's aircraft as well. So, probably in the region of 130 aircraft coming in a strike. Both your carriers are going to be hit hard. They're either going to be sunk or they're going to be out of action. At which point, strikes will probably still go in though. But if they go in piecemeal, there are problems. There's more fighters, there's more air defense. They can better survive it. So that's why I said a 2-2. What do you think happens? How do you think that affects the way the war is prosecuted on both sides? I'd be really interested to hear your opinion. Really interested to hear your opinion. That being said, what do we have coming next week? Well, this week's Midway. Next week is Admiral Percy Walker-Nels transforming the Canadian Navy into its World War II force. That's going to be an interesting thing for leadership. It is going to be an interesting thing for leadership. Take care, thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed. Have fun.